we have Dr. Janet Bettger with us from Duke. You all know that she is an investigator on the COMPASS study team as well. She provides us lots of help and support as we continue to study the best ways to take care of patients as they transition from the hospital directly to home. She has a real passion for research, and particularly in stroke, and she's also very, very modest. When I asked her about her introduction, she said, just say that I'm a stroke researcher on healthcare quality and outcomes as my bio, and that will do. We could spend the whole hour just telling you about Janet's many accomplishments. I did pull a couple of notes that we've used on her before, and she'll probably want to shoot me by email later, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about her. Yeah, I'm not gonna say a lot, but I just want everyone to know a little bit more about you, Janet. She is very dedicated to improving healthcare quality and care coordination for older adults with chronic conditions, particularly stroke, as well as those at risk for functional decline or rehospitalization. So you can see why we really, really wanted her to work on our COMPASS team. And she is the principal investigator on some other studies, both the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, like where our funding comes from, or PCORI, as well as NIH-funded studies. And she has led a number of projects and written many, many publications, and she speaks not only to lots of students at Duke, nursing students and other students, but across our state, across our nation, and internationally. And we are very, very fortunate to have her taking time out of her busy schedule this afternoon to present to us on how research drives evidence-based care. And without further ado, because I don't want her to shoot me, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Janet Bettger to have her presentation and some discussion with you all this afternoon. So Janet, take it away.
Thanks so much, Sylvia. That was kind of you. I am fairly new when you think in terms of how people come about living in North Carolina. I've only been here for 8 years, but I'm not new to stroke in this work, and I'm guessing that some of you aren't either. The reason why I wanted to start there is that it's really funny. I pulled out a box yesterday that was under my desk, and I pulled out some articles, and we are still talking about moving research into practice today the same way we were a decade ago, actually 2 decades ago. And when you think where we are today at 2018, we are 20 years past when TPA was approved, and we are still talking about doing research to be able to improve care and outcomes related to that hyperacute and acute phase of stroke. And that's why I think it was so exciting that we were able to get so many hospitals and so many people invested in COMPASS and thinking about post-stroke recovery, because we needed to do this independent of the innovation and advancements in care around acute treatment. I mean, we could have been looking at a model like COMPASS literally decades ago, because we needed to figure out, we've always needed to figure out how to better do the discharge process and how to support people going home. So this discussion is really going to be kind of a back and forth between research and practice. I mean, if you want to go ahead to the first slide, what I've put up is something that I think all of you at some point have seen in some iteration when we talk about evidence-based practice, for example, PICO questions, et cetera, where if we were to start in the upper right corner of formulating a research question just based on day-to-day care, this is not so different than when we talk about literally, like, how could we do something different or better? And so I want to go around this cycle once from a research perspective, and then once from a quality perspective, and just talk about that, because I think at the heart of who you are as in all of your different roles, we do this and on a day-to-day basis on even an N of 1 literally a patient, a provider, a process. And what we've done essentially with Compass is, of course, explode that across 40 hospitals and 6,000 patients. So, we have a question, whatever it is, and then we move that question into, how would we actually build towards something, people use the word purpose or an aim or a goal or an objective, something that we're working towards that's bigger than that one directive that we identified that needed to be addressed. We go to the literature. We're supposed to always go to the literature and figure out what's already been done, who's looked at this, what's out there, maybe in other fields or other disciplines. And then we say, I think if we were to do X, Y, and Z, it would go in this direction. And that's where we get a hypothesis from. From that question, the question is supposed to drive our design, whether it's pre-post, whether it needs to be a trial, whether we're just going to follow it and see how it goes. And then we do a small study. This could cycle back. We do a larger study. We collect data. We sometimes analyze it at the same time. Sometimes we wait till the end. And if things go the way we hoped, we use that data to say, yep, we should absolutely change how we're doing or what we're doing and how we're doing it. And what's interesting about a cycle like this is at a very simplified level, we do this even if you think about it, I don't know what your commutes are like, but even when we drive to work in the morning. So I have a Google Home in my home, and I usually say, what's my commute like today? And they say, it's going to be X number of minutes. And I'm like, all right, so do I take this path to work or this path to work? Because my purpose for the day is getting here fast because I'm already leaving late. I'm not going to go review the literature, but I usually have a hypothesis whether I'm going to take back roads or the highway and which way this is going to go. It won't be a randomized trial. I'm just going to go observe how this went, my own data collections, my clock, and how that goes, and then I change practice based on that. Did I leave at 7:17 today? Did I leave at 5:17 today? Did I leave at 9:17 today? And how that's going to work. This cycle is something that we do every day, and when we apply this in a research framework, different than a quality framework, it shifts the direction because of how we're using those data. So I want to go ahead from this really simplified process that I think we do inherently just in clinical practice and in our day-to-day lives to kind of the bigger picture of research, and then I want to come back to clinical practice. If we can go to the third slide, Megan, whatever the next one is. Great, the bigger picture. So these 12 steps, interestingly enough, I could actually be even bigger than this. If you start at step 1 from a research cycle, if we were talking about medications, as I'd mentioned, either TPA or pick your hypertension drug or whatever that is, it'd be FDA. Potentially driving an agenda. This could be, for us in this trial, it was CMS driving an agenda. And then for Compass, here we had CMS put out a directive around transitional care based on work that had been done in the field. And rather than driving an NIH, the National Institute of Health roadmap, it actually drove a line of inquiry for PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. PCORI actually set out data standards. They weren't so different than what we're getting from other federal agencies, which is great. And it slowly set off a set of priorities around networks and being able to work across sites, et cetera. What I wanted to share with you out of these early steps on priorities and ethics, et cetera, is that what we were doing here in the post-hospital phase is not so different than, for those of you that have been in stroke especially, had seen or came in the tail end of for what had to be done for TPA. Except the idea of delivering a drug that had to be, that everybody thought was going to be a really simple thing to implement. Here we have TPAs approved, everybody go do it, and they thought it was just going to be this no-brainer. We'll do the trial, we know it works, and let's move on. Actually ended up being just as complex as Compass. Okay, so we've got patient perspectives, provider perspectives and behaviors, and we've got an organizational issue, time being one of them, but there were many, right? Organization with the labs and CT and everything else. So what's really interesting, if you think 20 years ago where research was for stroke care, everybody was like, yeah, we figured out that we can use TPA to treat stroke. It was effective. But what they could have done the trial on 20 years ago was not only to figure out whether it worked or not, but how they were going to get it to people, how they were going to get providers to understand who should deliver it, how they were going to determine whether you could, do the labs at the same time you were doing, at that time we were still talking about consent, whether you could go right to the CT, whether, like, all of those pieces were not part of the original studies. Imagine if they had been, potentially how much further we'd be today on being able to get people treated. But that's not how those studies were designed. They were designed to figure out, did the drug work or not? So here we are with Compass, a little bit more involved. And I just wanted to draw those parallels because a lot of people thought, oh, we would figure out that TPA worked and then everybody would just go use it. And then at the same time, when we positioned the Compass trial, everybody was like, oh, it's a no-brainer. Of course, everybody should get follow-up from neurology. Why are we needing to study this? And you guys know this has not been a small task. And so designing research to be both embedded in what we do and part of practice is a different way of thinking about research. It does have its challenges and drawbacks, so doesn't it? I do want to hear your perspective in a minute on that. I want to go to the next slide just briefly, Megan, if you could. Our biggest issue is that clinical research is slow. And I want to go through two funny examples of why it's already slow and why Compass was designed the way it is and why it was so important that you guys be a part of it in all of your different roles. So if we go to the next slide, it's a pipeline. This is just on drug delivery, and it's very similar to intervention delivery, that it literally takes 15 years to go from an idea to having something be approved to know that it actually works. So from a drug manufacturing perspective and the amount of dollars invested in this process, it takes a lot of money and a really long time. And unfortunately, clinical interventions, even without medication, also take this long by the time you do your first pilot, by the time you figure out what the data collection strategies are, how do you do it in one site, how do you do it in more sites. It also takes a really long time to figure out what works. What we did with Compass, though, was trying to think about what are the things we're already doing with the care that we're providing, and how can we do this differently so that from idea to implementation doesn't take 15 years. So I'm going to give you one more perspective on this. Let's go to the next slide. This is another pipeline view of why people are saying that it can take a really long time to go from an idea. We have a couple of these actually, a really long time to go from an idea to actually implementation and practice. We get this priority for research funding, and in our case, it was transitional care. By the time you submit a grant, you have it reviewed. By the time people actually go ahead and do that work and publish on it, that there be enough studies to have with enough patients and across enough sites to actually have a synthesis that says, yep, this is the way we should go. And then we develop guidelines for care, and then those guidelines are supposed to influence practice. All of this takes a really long time, and every single nudge is like another couple of years and another couple of years, and adding this up again is usually projected to be anywhere from 13 to 14 or to 17 years. If we go one more slide, I just want to show you data from a decade ago that still makes me giggle a little bit. And I was going to pull the stroke data, but it was I couldn't find the North Carolina stroke data specific. So this one's from Cardiac Care. From 430 hospitals, these were they Get With the Guidelines hospitals? I think they were Get With the Guidelines hospitals. When they were looking at differences in care across hospitals from the leading facilities to the lagging facilities, some of these data ended up driving public reporting. But for those of you that have seen your benchmark reports against other hospitals, we still see, and you could pick your medication, your care component, we still see differences like this. And that's how literally most of the country is functioning right now on that one readmissions and then mortality if they're monitoring that as a 30-day outcome. And so here we invested all of this effort into establishing these acute hospital measures, and it really wasn't until COMPASS that we started thinking, how do we have post-hospital measures in that interim span within the 30 days to be able to know what kind of care is being provided? And so the type of research ends up being different, and that's why I use TPAs as an example. It isn't just one thing that works. It's collectively how do we really look at a lot of things together and how they work. And that type of research and being able to do it as part of practice is where it's difficult to separate what we do and creating like this ideal, clean, untouched environment where everything works perfectly, because that's just not real life. So when you think about being able to measure what we do at a level and actually be able to establish measures the way we have with COMPASS and document on those, and so for those of you that are collecting data, it is a really important point, because a really important part of the work that we do, it's as important to drive care as it is to be able to know that once we have those data, how do we able to work together in this kind of research collaborative to be able to move care forward and provide better care for more people. Now again, this is not knowing if collectively all these things work or not, but because we know that doing certain things is the right care for people, and then trying to customize the components of those to work best for patients is part of the research process. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. This is what we're seeing across studies, that if we just once we know that a certain component of care works, if we just go out and tell people that it worked and share it the way we normally do, publications, presentations, whatever, it will take over 17 years, about 14% of the providers or the systems that need to adopt it will have adopted it. 14%. If we do something with it, and this is where we actually have all of you that are working in this post-acute space driving processes forward, you're literally implementation teams. So you're shifting what would happen normally in care, and we're able to show a tremendous level of uptake of what we think are the best strategies. The research part came with, while we think these are the right things, do they reach the outcomes that we think we're actually impacting? And let me tell you, actually, you guys probably already all know this. When that readmissions measure came out, people went out and did a lot of things without knowing whether it was going to work or not to hit that readmissions measure. Well, I think what's been really interesting in watching this kind of response to the readmissions measure in particular has been the let's try it and see. And so if we go to the next slide, which is likely not unfamiliar to most, if not all of you, is that from a performance improvement or quality improvement perspective, here at Duke we use Six Sigma. I was trained in IHI, but different people use different frameworks. From a performance improvement perspective, that's exactly what we did. We're like, let's go see. We'll go and do this, see if our data changes. We'll study it, see if we need to refine it. We just kept doing these iterative cycles and hope that it would change outcomes. We really didn't have the evidence to inform it, at least not for stroke. So it really wasn't that we could come at this from an evidence-based practice perspective to say, we're going to use the existing literature to drive what we do and how to implement it here. And so I think a lot of the groups and areas that we worked in were like, well, let's work with what we have and see if we can iterate on it and make things better. Kind of holding out for that 30-day outcome. The difference here in what we've been able to do in working with all of you is by being able to frame these as research questions. And there are many questions we could have asked. The difference of who to see primary care or neurology. The difference of when do you make that call? Is it 2 days? Is it 7 days? Is it 14 days? The difference of what you do on that call or what you do in the visit. All of those things are testable, and we didn't and don't have evidence for any of those. And that's where I think, we were able to come at this for Compass from a research perspective, where we had recommended that we adopt a strategy and move forward, collect these data, have it centrally analyzed and be able to disseminate how that was. But we were sensitive to the fact that you're all functioning every day in a practice environment where you needed feedback. And that's where we were conscious of creating these measures to be able to provide input on, here's what was provided and when, for those that were in the intervention sites to know this is how often things were provided. And so this ended up being an opportunity for us to study a shift in care and be able to think maybe, I was going to say more strategically, but that's unfair. Be able to think and implement in a way that we could look across sites with a bottom line expectation. So if we go to the next slide. Thanks, Megan. We were coming at Compass from a place where we wanted to be able to generalize findings, which it was and is different than how we do local practice improvement projects. And so we could have continued to structure the work that we were doing and work with all of your hospitals and compare all the different models that were out there and see which ones actually made a difference on and for which patients. Some of the challenges in that are still resting in the standardization around data, being sure that we're comparing similar patients, being sure that we have a measure around what the organization and the system look like. And so I put this here, this framework here of research, EBP, and performance improvement, just as a reminder for those of you that had described that maybe you have less intensive or structured research infrastructures around you, that the work that you're doing, even in the performance improvement space, by being able to study it and measure it in a way that can be disseminated to other sites, could be driving a research framework in a way that you may not have thought was impactful. And so I like to think about the questions that we have, particularly coming out of clinical practice, as sure, we maybe have something that's very specific that we want to study, but how could we then iterate on it to better understand whether it also improves care? If we go to the next slide on evidence-based practice in particular, I think all of you realize, or maybe I can use this as a reminder, that how we provide care includes all of these components. And when we started Compass, the best research we had was not from the US, was not specific to stroke. And we didn't have and still don't have evidence-based practice guidelines on post-hospital follow-up and care transitions for stroke patients. And hopefully the work that we're doing will guide us there and get us to a place. Canada has national evidence-based guidelines for stroke transitional care. Europe does as well. But where the more that all of you can be involved, provide your clinician expertise and the voice of your patients into how we do this work, all of that collectively contributes to where we need to go to move this field forward. So if we go to the next slide on why research, we could have continued, and I know many other areas are continuing to do this, focusing on transitional care as part of practice, really from a performance and quality improvement perspective within their sites, or sometimes within multiple sites within a larger organization. And they ask all the time, and I've spoken on this several times, why research? Why do we need to go study it? And ultimately, it's so that we can use these findings to drive clinical decisions. We can use these findings to drive clinical practice beyond a single organization. And we can use these findings ultimately to be able to structure a standardized assessment of quality and be able to begin to study cost, because I'm sure your institutions like mine are really keen on how much they're investing in care and where they could shift those costs for other things. The ROI here, so I said there's a really clear ROI in measuring practice, and we do all the time, but this is our first opportunity to think about how do we measure post-hospital care and how do we learn from it, not only to reach these intended outcomes, but be able to shape practice beyond our own institution. And so by working with all of you across all of your organizations and being able to say that across as many hospitals that we have, we've been able to standardize data collection, we've been able to look at the patients that we serve, understand their needs, and maybe we'll need to continue to iterate on this, but being able to have this kind of structure to how we ask the question and how we studied transitional care is going to not only inform our own work in North Carolina, but the work of people and facilities and communities outside of here. I want to go to the next slide because I think it looks as though several of you are healthcare providers. For those of you that see patients directly, I can't say enough times, and I'm sure Sylvia does every time she gets on the phone with you, and she started even today's call with saying thank you. By being involved in research and having your patients understand that you're involved in research, even when you can't fully communicate where you are in the larger picture of research, having them understand that the institution values generating information that's going to inform a bigger picture and a larger agenda has been known to be really important. So we didn't have to necessarily enroll patients in this study, but interestingly for other studies, look at this, 75% of patients will enroll in trial if they're asked by their healthcare provider. So recommending that, for example, for this study, somebody's going to call you when you leave the hospital. Having them hear that from you means so much more to the likelihood of them responding and participating. And it is crucial to being able to get that outcome data later on when they hear it from a healthcare provider that somebody's going to call them for this information. This next bullet here, 32% of patients in clinical trials said that their healthcare provider took the time to answer all of their questions. So for people that are leaving the hospital, this is their time to ask questions, and sometimes for some people that's their only time to ask questions. For some people coming back to the clinic, they will come prepared with questions and other times won't. If we can continue to engage in this dialogue about how they're helping us understand care, particularly care for people going directly home from the hospital, and how we're studying this to continue to make it better, will help them talk about not only their own experience, but also what could have gone differently. And then asking those questions about research and being able to reinforce that by them participating in their follow-up calls, we're then learning what works better for some people and differently for others. And this last point, participating patients were more likely to have first learned about a trial through their healthcare provider. Contacting people after they're involved in an encounter like a stroke hospitalization is really hard. I'm not sure at this point when we think about stroke patients, how many of our patients always have the same family members with them in the hospital, but I think we could expand this point on participating patients to participating patients and their families so that other people know that their loved one or the person that had a stroke is going to be involved in research and what that means to the bigger picture. So I just wanted to emphasize and say thank you that all of you that are directly interacting with patients, your role in this research is key. Whether you were providing an intervention, whether you were collecting data, whether you were following up, whether you're providing a reminder, whether you were even printing things out for them. But your engagement with them is key because by knowing that you're involved in research will help them understand that they're involved in research and they're contributing to this larger vision of improving care by helping us study the work that we're doing. If we could go to the next slide, so 5 dimensions of research clinicians, let's say. What you likely think about every day is your clinical practice. And some of you may have administrative responsibilities on your job as well. And what I wanted to show you is that all of these things come together as being involved in research. And what can be really difficult, being a part of research in your facility often means that one person is doing a lot of these things. What's really interesting is that even if you're the guy, or you're the person that has to take everything on, I would encourage, or maybe empower you to think that even the people that have multiple people involved in a research team, or there actually is a team on the ground that's participating in a single study, that everybody should be alerted to all of these rules. What's really interesting is this, like, for example, this idea of human subjects protection. From a clinical practice perspective, we do this every day, right? We don't share information. We're protective of where data are stored. We think about our the ethics behind our encounters, how we invite people to participate, how we share information with families. So the idea of human subjects protection, and even from consent to all of the pieces around data and safety, what's interesting is that sometimes, and I've seen some institutions where this is literally one person's job, like that's what they do, is the human subjects, IRB, all those components. But really, if you're frontline and interacting with the patients, you still have a role in this. You really can't get away from this component because it's something that you're thinking about in your interactions all the time. No matter who you are and what your role is in this study, all of you are contributing to the science every single day by interacting with patients, by changing their experience, by giving them information, by collecting data, by entering those data. All of that contributes to the science, because as we miss any of those components, it shifts what we're able to learn. And the ability to move that forward, and this next, I'm going backwards in the, well, I guess I'm going clockwise in the circle, by being able to work, in this case, across not only across the hospital, but hospital into home and then into the clinic, that level of continuity is, I think, still something that we're trying to aspire towards in stroke care. And we have literally pushed the pedal on this one for this trial. So the roles in this are so varied, and some people might have a single person, like I said, working across all of these things. But whether if you're in a facility with more people engaged in this trial, you may have people at the front end and people at the other end, but all of you have a role in care coordination and continuity in this study, because it takes, I think, as I was mentioning, I think it's harder with larger teams and bigger facilities with more patients to actually be able to do this well, because you have to use the same language, you have to coordinate across each other. And so I envy others of you that are in smaller institutions, because while it is more work, I would agree, to engage in research, you're able to be able to have a higher level of engagement across all of these things, and the coordination then may stop with you or with fewer people. From a study management perspective, I have to say that I'm always really sensitive, and I know Sylvia has been as well, in working with sites, because it is work that's beyond this one triangle of clinical practice. But hopefully once all of you have kind of gotten into a rhythm, this has really come together for you at a place that's been more comfortable and become, part of the day that you have every day.
I guess I would want to conclude first to say thank you. It can be a big ask to ask a site to participate in research, and even a bigger ask if your site doesn't have the research infrastructure to participate in research beyond a single setting, because this is definitely a bigger picture across setting, lots of providers, lots of moving pieces. And I hope that what you're taking away from this experience are those examples of valuing practice
patient care, the patient experience, and how you're contributing to the science that we don't have yet on things that we continue to iterate on all the time. So thank you, and I hope that this has given you maybe the will to want to do this again in other studies in the future.